The Athletic.
The race is on, and Max Verstappen added victory in the Chinese Grand Prix to his glittering CV as F1 returned to Shanghai for the first time in 5 years. But once again, it was the battle behind him that caught the eye on the first of F1's revamped sprint weekends. So why did Red Bull seem even more dominant this weekend, and what happened to Ferrari's challenge? I'm Edd Straw, and joining us to tell all are Scott Mitchell-Malm and Mark Hughes. Well, Scott, welcome. How did you enjoy F1's return to China?
Can I answer that question honestly?
Yes.
I enjoyed it a lot more for not being there. I find it like I really didn't. I had absolutely no problem with being at the track and experiencing. I say Shanghai. It's sort of outside Shanghai. The one time I did this race in 2018, I did Beijing Formula E a few years before that, which was also very interesting. But the reason I say it is because it's an awful lot less convenient working this race on site. It's a lot more restrictive, shall we say. It's a lot more hassle. As for actually just the race being back itself, I hadn't realised I'd quite missed this circuit and this race. It's actually it's quite good. It's dynamic. It has elements from the track itself and the challenges that help increase the opportunity to spice things up. I always say this about Baku as well. As long as the track invites the kind of conditions that can create safety cars or unpredictability, I'm fine with those variables coming into play because it just feels somehow a bit less artificial when it kind of crops up because it's kind of just what the track and the area produce. So I like that. But you were there on site, Ed. Can you verify on behalf of the listeners I am not being needlessly unfair on China or working in Shanghai? Was it a bit difficult this weekend?
It is very awkward. There are things to like about it, and it was great to see. This was the most kind of enthusiastic and engaged and convincing fan base I've ever seen at this race. Coming out of the circuit quite late last night, there were loads of fans hanging around the car parks. It was a bit like a sort of mini Suzuka in that regard. You know, at Suzuka, there's always fans hanging around. No matter how early you go in, how late you leave, there's always a mob of them all waiting for a glimpse of somebody, and had a sort of a mini version of that this weekend, and all younger fans. But yeah, it's very, very difficult because you can't do things like use the internet very well. So all the tools you take for granted are gone. And I was deprived of all sorts of timing and that kind of thing. So actually the flow of information I had this weekend was significantly worse than for those just watching at home. So a bit awkward, but there are good things about being here. And I do agree with your point about the circuit. I almost feel, Mark, that it's a case of absence makes the heart grow fonder, hasn't it? Because we've come back to China and it's maybe not sort of thought of as a sort of classic circuit, shall we say, but it's almost achieved that status now that people have gone back, thought about what it offers again and what they missed. And actually, this is, for a modern F1 circuit, a relatively modern F1 circuit, of course, it's been around for 20 years now, it's a pretty good one. It's a nice, varied challenge and can produce some good battles.
Yeah, it is. It's always been a good track. I mean, you know, we talked about it in the preview of this race. It's got a bit of everything, and it leads to good races. And you know, there's quite often a bit of weather thrown in for a bit of randomness, which we saw during the sprint qualifying, and that made that. So yeah, I mean, I've got quite fond memories of China. I agree with Scott. It's right up there in the list of Hasley races in terms of, the sheer amount of effort you got to put in just to do stuff that should be effortless. But I got fond memories both of the track and of Shanghai, the city. I've spent a bit of time there. It's a fun place to be. So yeah, it's nice to see that the event has taken off, and the support that Zhou Guan Yu had there was really nice to see. So yeah, it's sort of flowering, isn't it? It's coming out in the flower. So I got quite a positive feeling about the whole weekend.
I do wonder if one of the reasons why we've come to appreciate this circuit a bit more is because of this little run of identikit new races that have new tracks that have appeared in the last few years. I mean, I know, well, one of them we haven't raced on yet, but I remember saying this when the Madrid circuit, there was a lap, obviously the Madrid circuit that's going to come onto the calendar soon, when a virtual lap of that got released, and you would really struggle to tell it apart from Miami or the Vegas track, for example. And even then before that, I mean, we're going back a few years now, but like a Sochi kind, that kind of circuit, do you know what I mean? Where it just feels a little bit lacking in character, and it's kind of crowbarring. It doesn't feel, because they're not, you notice when this track is not a purpose-built circuit. And this is just, this is what it's for. Do you know what I mean? Like the layout. I quite like. There was a point during the race, I can't remember what battle I was seeing, but it was what the cars were snaking their way through sort of 7, 8, and then 9, and then back out of 10. And I loved the shot because you can just see from the rear view the cars like dancing, really squirming around as they're sort of they're under acceleration, but they're also loaded up as they come out of that double left-hander as well. They're like stressing the car so much, and you were getting 2 or 3 laps into the stint. And I know that this is partly because the tyres are a bit rubbish, but like it's a real challenge to just sort of make this circuit work over a race distance. I genuinely think you could have a mega set of tyres. If we go back to tyre war days and revive those, they would still really stress everything, and I just really like that in a circuit.
Yeah, there's a lot to like about the track. And of course, they added the little fire feature by turn 7 as well that caused some problems on Friday with the grass catching fire, which was a mystery.
Can you explain it?
Well, no, not really. They never quite got to the bottom of it because it happened in FP1, it happened in qualifying. It only caused 1 red flag because it timed the eruption in in qualifying neatly for the end of Q1. I say eruption, it was a very localised fire, but it was in exactly the same spot both times. And the FI inspects it. The working theory is that there may be some kind of gas build-up that was being vented, and not gas pipeline or anything, but this track's built on a marshland basically, so you can have marsh gas type things. And the working theory that was what was being ignited by the hot sparks from the cars hitting the ground, because of course hot sparks from Formula One cars hit grass all the time, and this doesn't happen. So there was some kind of accelerant there, but it wasn't conclusively found. But of course, it's quite hard to conclusively find. So they parked a fire truck there and made sure that they were dampening it down regularly. It was just one of those complete curiosities that this little patch of fire grass.
Oh, it's the weirdest thing I think I've ever seen at an F1 track. I can't think of anything else that comes close to that. Just this really, really specific area that just keeps catching fire. What a ridiculous thing to have happened. Yeah,
it's completely bizarre, but it's just added a little memorable feature. But for me, the thing that struck was the enthusiasm of the crowd, which was like nothing we've seen in China before. In the race, you sit up in the media centre, which is, people will know those 2 very high bridges, for want of a better word, across the start-finish straight. And the one closest to the last corner contains the media centre, so we're up there, so kind of overlooking the start-finish straight and the pit lane, and you can hear the crowd really well. Every time Zhou Guan Yu did anything, there was a huge cheer. Loads of big cheers for Hamilton as well. He was getting cheers every time he crossed the line in the sprint race in the lead, which admittedly wasn't that many laps. And
he's got a really, really big fan base in China.
Yes, very much so, yeah. But the thing that really tells me that China has got a proper knowledgeable fan base was earlier in the weekend when Sauber were doing pit stop practice on Friday. Every time they did a successful pit stop practice, there was a big cheer from a load of people in the crowd because they'd all absorbed the fact that Sauber had pit stop problems. And that's
amazing.
It's a tiny detail, but I think that's always a sign. If people talk about knowledgeable fan bases, and that's just a sign that the crowd are fully immersed in it. And it's not there was no Chinese fans who were following F1 at all before, but there feels like there's been real movement, and they're really feeling part of it now. And that's the thing that, for all the awkwardness of covering this race, I was really pleased to see, because it feels like there's been a proper step change, and ultimately that's driven by a driver who is only driving around in a lower team. You know, Zhou is not a big name and not able to get great results because of the machinery, but I think that's quite encouraging for Formula One's desire to break into China, which of course is motivated by the commercial imperative and money, but you want races in places where there's people who care, and that's what we've now got in China.
But one thing I would say on that is that obviously we touched on this in the preview podcast, didn't we? Which is obviously if Zhou doesn't stay on the grid beyond this year, which we all think is very possible that he doesn't stay in F1, how much of a decline will that have? Because you could see just how important he was to this race and to the fan base and the effort that F1 went to by the fact that he had a place on the grid to pull up into at the end of the race. So he didn't come back into Parc Fermé. Where I'm interested to know what you two thought of that, because I feel like you have to be really careful with that kind of thing, because one, it can come across a little bit as pandering to the audience, and two, it can unfairly or unnecessarily kind of give prominence to a driver that hasn't really achieved anything. But because this was so significant, the first Chinese driver to race in a Chinese Grand Prix, I just thought it was quite nice. I don't think I want to see it every year. But what did you two think?
I can't really comment because I charged off down to speak to drivers. I think I was hearing a series of complaints from Daniel Ricciardo at the time that was happening. So that's the first I've heard of it. So Mark will now answer.
Yeah, I liked it. It was like Scott says, it's a very special occasion, isn't it? And a very significant one. So I don't think there's anything wrong to pandering to the crowd in those circumstances. I think it was a nice little thank you to them for coming and sort of adopting the sport and following of the sport.
Yeah, I think my point is definitely that there was nothing wrong with it in this instance. I just think you pick your moments, right? Like you wouldn't do it at Silverstone. I don't think you could have Hamilton, Russell, and Norris come round and Albon could maybe like half park his car on the track and half in the garage. But you just wouldn't do it there, would you? Because the British Grand Prix it's so well established. The British drivers are so well established. The support, there's nothing. What's the word? Like, it's not that there's nothing to celebrate, but you know what I'm trying to say. Whereas here, it just felt like
it meant something.
It was worth recognising and give them that opportunity.
Yeah, and Zhou himself said he was feeling the pressure this weekend that China was really expecting, and it was a big event for him. So it's good that he was able to have a little bit of a moment, and he had some moments of promise over the weekend. But of course, qualifying poorly, the mistake he made in Q1 meant that he wasn't really a factor in the Grand Prix itself. Well, let's get to the race, Mark, because this was another straightforward weekend for Max Verstappen, with perhaps the only infinitesimal stumble, only qualifying fourth for the sprint. But how did the Grand Prix itself play out?
Yeah, I mean, it's the Verstappen dominance was probably the biggest we've seen so far this year. And he was even on a slightly disadvantageous strategy in that he built up that big lead, and then the safety car came and wiped it out. And the safety car also meant, of course, that he'd had to pit just 10 laps after getting onto his first set of hard tyres. So thankfully, they'd saved a second set of hard tyres, so he was able to put those on when the safety car came, which was easily enough, comfortable enough to get him to the end. And he pulled out that big gap all over again. So yeah, just a very clear, unambiguous story of Verstappen superiority. The intrigue was what was going on behind, and we had that great Lando Norris second place, and we thought, when because Perez had ended up getting shuffled down at the second pit stops and had to fight his way past Leclerc, and you just assumed, right, once he's got past Leclerc, he'll track down Lando, but he didn't have the pace to do that, and partly that was because of how much he'd taken from his tyres in getting by Leclerc, but it was also down to a very, very canny performance by Lando, and they had the McLaren was much better on the tyres than anyone was expecting, and Lando had made a bet with his race engineer that he'd be 35 seconds behind a Ferrari at the end, and obviously he lost that bet. But the car was worked very well, unexpectedly well, for reasons they're beginning to understand, but not fully. But also Norris himself and the way he was treating that car, or more specifically those tyres, with kid gloves, and you watch him on board, and it's just how gentle he's being with all his inputs. And he's keeping it off the curbs on the exit. Because when you go over those serrations on the exit curbs, they put so much heat into the tyres, into the rear tyres, and so that's he was making sure he wasn't doing that. And you might have heard him talking to Max in the green room afterwards, saying, "Yeah, I was inside that white line the whole race." And you heard Max say, "What, the whole race?" He said, "Yeah." And you might have heard him when his engineer said, "If you want to reduce the understeer, you can use a bit more engine braking." And he just said, "No, thank you." And he's quite happy with the amount of understeer because that was protecting the rears. So it was a very, very canny performance. And that's how that played out. And it left Ferrari a little bit bewildered because they'd done what they thought was the responsible thing in changing the setup going into qualifying after the sprint, of putting a bit more understeer into the car. And if you look on board, Leclerc has got more understeer in the car than Norris. But it was all about, as it turned out, about equalising the tyre temperatures between the front and rear axles, and the McLaren, or Norris's McLaren, was just doing that better than either Ferrari. And he was he wasn't even under any threat for that second place in the end.
Yeah, I was going to ask you actually, Mark, as you were explaining that, because I did have a theory earlier on, immediately after the race, based on a little bit of what Ferrari had kind of indicated already on Saturday, and the fact that McLaren just seemed so surprised, even by the end of Sunday, or certainly by the end of the race, because it's still Sunday as we sit and record this, that they didn't have the clear answers, that it felt a little bit like a couple of key factors around this weekend. One, as you were explaining, that sort of shift away from it traditionally being front limited and becoming rear limited, and the changes people made to need to be able to address that, or just the way, I guess, it made the cars behave and what that brought into play. And then also something that was talked about very early in the weekend, which was the possibility for the grip to change, not just round the lap, but in corner, because of however they treated the surface. And it just felt to me like this combination raised the ceiling of what the McLaren was capable of. So it was above where McLaren expected the car to be, but it also maybe brought a couple of others back, because that Ferrari that's the first time, correct me if I'm wrong, that the McLaren has just been quicker than the Ferrari on a Sunday. Yeah. So it felt like a little bit like the scales kind of tipped slightly in each direction.
Yeah, it was just like balanced, that little fulcrum. And I'm sure that strange surface coating must have had something to do with it. But it's not as simple as that, because the McLaren had a lot of rear deg in the sprint race, which, was only 19 laps or whatever. And that's why Norris was so, downbeat going into the race, because he was saying, "Well, I managed to hang on to the Ferraris for a while, but it was only because we're in a DRS train behind Alonso." He said, "Our rear deg's nowhere." He said, "We've still got a lot of work to do." And then that wasn't the issue on the race. The conditions had changed a little bit. It was a bit cooler. The wind had died down. All those things probably have an influence. But it's just the specific way it changed the tyre challenge. It's these things balance on very delicate points, and get just the wrong side of it, and you'll see quite a spectacular swing. And I think that's what we're looking at.
Scott, the other team that was a factor, certainly in the sprints near the front and a little bit less near the front in the Grand Prix itself, was Mercedes. Ultimately, some decent results. Lewis Hamilton was second in the sprint, George Russell sixth today. But it's very much a weekend of two halves for Hamilton in particular, wasn't it?
It was. I think the car that they had for the sprint was quite different to the car that they ended up having for qualifying and the race. Similar in, I guess, principle to what Mark was explaining, with pretty much what every team had to battle with, which was kind of learning as they went through the weekend, and then what they experienced during the sprint, having had that wet end to sprint qualifying, which slightly jumbled the order, kind of indicated that certain changes needed to be made, because neither Mercedes driver was happy with the balance on the Saturday. Lewis had done a great job with his sprint quali performance in the wet at the end to get that track position, and then drove extremely well in the sprint race. So what Lewis did in the sprint, I actually think was just at the very, very, very top end of what we can expect from that Mercedes in a good moment, which is that if it has track position, I think it can race very competitively over a stint with the Mercedes, the McLarens, Ferraris, and Aston Martins. So yes, the result there was an overachievement, but the sort of the principles behind it were kind of sound, really, based on what we've seen so far. But then they make their changes, and I get the impression, and I review too, please correct me if I'm wrong on this, I get the impression that there were changes on both cars, but more on Lewis's and more significant, substantial changes on Lewis's. And it was at his behest rather than a case of in 22, for example, where the team's doing slightly strange experiments to get the car in a better window and Lewis is the experienced driver, so he does it. Lewis wanted to do a certain, take the car in a certain direction, try and magically get it into the window where it actually works better, and took it the other way. So Russell then ended up bang in the middle of where Mercedes kind of is on a normal weekend, which is sniping at picking off a McLaren and a Ferrari and an Aston Martin and no better. And Lewis was right at the bottom end of it. Obviously, quali was exaggerated by the error, so that's why his grid position was so bad. But then in the race, the car was all over the place because he'd basically destroyed the balance with the changes. And at the end of the race, over the radio, he apologised for driving that change. So it was clearly something that he had pushed for specifically rather than something the team wanted him to do.
Yeah, it was a mechanical change, and it was quite extreme. And it resulted in the car just not wanting to change direction at all. And it obviously that had its impacts on tyre life, etc.
It looked awful on onboard. I had sight of Hamilton's onboard for pretty much the entire Grand Prix because I was just really curious to hear the exchanges really as much as anything else and how he was dealing with it. And it looked at low speed in particular absolutely horrific. He just could not get the front in and then couldn't get it rotated. And you could see it when he was battling with other cars, slower cars, and cars that at times had worse tyres than him. The hairpin was such a great example, and this was part of the reason he made the mistake that he did in qualifying, because he was really struggling to get the car slowed down without locking, basically in qualifying. And then come the race, he'd have the run on the car in front. He'd be on the outside going into that hairpin. And then what you want to do in that situation when that car in front is defended on the inside is you're obviously looking to rotate the rear and then try and cut back if possible and get past them. But if not, cut back and put them under pressure. But Lewis on the outside basically couldn't even turn as sharply as the car on the inside. So he was never quite getting the drive off that hairpin that he wanted either. It's really rare that you see the car that's on the attack in that situation and with better tyres being the one that looks so lazy at low speed.
Hamilton, after the race, actually said, "I've never had so much understeer in my life." So
I can imagine. I can see why.
Yeah, that was clearly troubling him. And of course, we had the usual chat with Toto Wolff, the team principal, after the race, and he was trying to be positive about while they've got quite a long way to go, can just add performance, and they struggle a bit to get low speed and high speed performance. And he said, "Well, we understand both of those. We just had to connect them up," which he may sound very easy, but it's pretty much the fundamental challenge of these regulations. So yeah, I think it hasn't revealed a huge amount about Mercedes, but the point you made about the sprint race, that it shows how much you can benefit from in that battle where it's quite marginal, particularly when you've got a car like the Mercedes that tends to race a little bit better than it qualifies. Certainly that was the case for Russell. Then you can do that. But if you're a little bit further back, it gets an awful lot harder. Mark, we should briefly talk about the fact this was the first modified sprint weekend. How was the new format for you? Did it seem a bit more logical?
Yeah, I liked it. I like especially the ability to be able to change the car in between the sprint and qualifying for the Grand Prix. It really did sort of add something to it. We saw completely different patterns on different days, although that was partly driven by the weather, but it was also thanks to the changes that they were able to make. It mixed it up. It made Saturday not feel disconnected from the rest of the weekend. And yeah, I liked it. I thought it was good. It was an improvement.
Yeah, certainly improvement. I think there's still a lot more they could do with the sprints, but it was better than last year, and the team's drivers seemed relatively happy with it. Carlos Sainz complained a little bit about the fact you had to go straight from that race mode into qualifying mode in a few hours on the Saturday, but that's just the nature of the beast, I guess.
One of the other things that Sainz mentioned about this was that the nature of a schedule like this is super intense, and the reason he brought it up, I think, was because he was talking about it in the context of whether he'd had chance to speak to Leclerc and clear the air after their run-in during the sprint race. And did the two of you notice that the Sainz and Leclerc had said different things about that on Saturday? Leclerc said that they'd spoken and it was all sorted, and Sainz said that they hadn't had a chance to speak.
Yeah, that was a good clash of a good clash of stories. I mean, I think that one was that particular incident, I think, was easy to get, because it seemed quite incendiary, but I think it was just one of those things that I think Sainz slightly misjudged the grip he had on the inside, and that led to Leclerc being forced wide, because of course it worked out very badly for everyone in red, because it was a big part in Perez being able to nip past. Drivers getting used to it. Lando Norris was asked about it, and he just said, "Oh, I'm not particularly fussed. I'll just get in the car when they tell me to and drive, and this is for the fans." So plenty of drivers found it much of a muchness. Right, well, Scott, let's get on to the first restart, because there was a mishap when Lance Stroll rear-ended Daniel Ricciardo's RB. I know we're meant to technically call it a V-carb. If you're going to abbreviate that team, you've got to abbreviate it to V-carb, even though they have abbreviated their own team. Well, not abbreviated, their own team name is RB. I'm not abbreviating RB to V-carb. Sorry. Anyway, rant over.
It's not an abbreviation.
I'll get back to the matter at hand now.
It's 2.5 times as long.
Exactly. It's just a nonsense. But anyway, I'll get back to the question, because then, of course, Ricciardo got rear-ended. He also clipped the rear of Oscar Piastri's McLaren, actually, and did a little bit of damage to the diffuser there as well. Stroll got a penalty for that. He was unapologetic. Daniel Ricciardo was not happy. But what did you make of the incident and the fallout?
I thought it was very careless from Stroll. I initially had a little bit of sympathy for him, because I thought it was a classic concertina effect, and I thought that it always gets worse the further down the train you are in that situation. But this wasn't that case at all. I think that's what Stroll and Aston Martin are trying to claim happened, but it wasn't like that. The gap was, there was a big enough gap between him and Ricciardo to be able to react to it. The three cars in front were close together and were able to react to it. And I actually agree with Ricciardo's assessment that it looks like Stroll was looking to the apex, which is understandable in a way, because that is what drivers do in normal racing situations. But this wasn't a normal racing situation, in that the race was restarting but hadn't restarted. And as Ricciardo pointed out, you don't know in that situation 100% whether you're going at that point, because you don't know what Verstappen's done at the front. That he might not go until the final corner or until after the hairpin or whatever. So Stroll just, I think, got a bit careless, didn't pay enough attention to the situation. And I think, not to say that I have done this, but I think anyone who has ever been checking their phone while in a traffic jam on the motorway or on the roads, and then looks up to suddenly see some brake lights ahead, they will probably have an idea of how Stroll felt in that situation.
And the thing is, it can catch you out, that sort of concertina effect in safety car restarts. I remember when I did in a race at Castle Queen, when I was probably not doing very well, so I was probably well down the order, and you get that sort of stop-go effect, and didn't hit anyone, but you sometimes get slightly caught out by it. But yeah, at this level, you know that's going to happen. And I was quite amused by the fallout for it, because the interesting thing was Ricciardo was not happy with what Stroll had said over the radio about it. Now, you might be able to help me here, Scott, because although I spoke to Ricciardo after, and he people were seeing some quite strong comments he's made, and some of them were in that, and that was because he'd been shown by, I think, Canal Plus, was it the French TV, or one of the I forget which French broadcaster it is now, but he'd been shown the footage and what Stroll had said over the radio, and he was quite angry about it, wasn't he?
He was. So there is a clip of him being told. I think there's one clip of him being told that Stroll said it was his fault, but I think he did get played the actual radio, or told what the radio message was, because in that conversation that you were in the mix zone, Ricciardo specifically says that Stroll called him an idiot. So he definitely heard the phrasing. He wasn't just told that Stroll was blaming him. And I will say for Lance that when he then got to you, as you will remember it, obviously you were literally there, Lance did say that he wasn't blaming Ricciardo specifically. He was saying those in front of him, and Ricciardo was just the one directly in front. And when you listen to the radio back, and people with better hearing might say I'm talking nonsense here, but I have listened to it a few times, and I can see why on the broadcast they put this idiot just braked or whatever it was that they said. But it's really hard to be sure that he doesn't say these idiots. I really am not sure it was the singular. It might have been the plural. But either way, he's counting Ricciardo as the idiot or one of the idiots. So I can see why Ricciardo was incensed, and that really did rile him up. The one thing I would add on this, we've talked a few times, haven't we, on this podcast about the sort of tendency to dish out penalties and apportion blame just seems to be bigger than ever. But I actually wondered, might be a good question for you, Mark, because I think you've sort of said a few times that sometimes you just need to accept that, racing incidents are racing incidents and happen. But is this one of the cases where actually, not only is a portion in blame and a penalty justified, but has Stroll got away with one by only getting 10 seconds for that in a race that he was nowhere in anyway and hasn't actually had a meaningful consequence, especially as he's not holding his hands up afterwards, is he? He's not going to learn from it. And that's what Ricciardo was saying. He's got to learn from this.
Yeah, I don't like penalties. But, clearly was Stroll was more to blame than anyone else for it. I'm just not a fan of the there must be blame. My entire thing is, it's racing. Shit happens. And, everybody deal with it afterwards. You're all big boys. That would be how I would look at it.
Well, Ricciardo was trying to deal with it a little bit, wasn't he, with what he said about Stroll? I mean, like you said, Scott, to be fair to Lance, just after Ricciardo had spoken, I did ask Lance a few questions about it, and he did make it clear he wasn't trying to blame Daniel specifically. But I didn't like the fact that was a complete sort of relinquishing of any responsibility. It's just one of those things. It happens, and it's just one of those things I like to see from a driver. If you see they realise they've made an error and they're like, I'm annoyed with that. You can imagine how Ricciardo would have been if he'd made that mistake and what he'd have said. He may have said something annoyed over the radio or whatever, but after he'd have been much more circumspect. But anyway, yeah. And of course, it wasn't the only penalty that an Aston Martin driver had, Mark, because we had that Alonso sprint race penalty for the barging with Carlos Sainz. That one was quite an odd one, wasn't it? Because that was, in traditional terms, which is something I always tend towards, just a bit of rubbings racing, really, isn't it? But it seems that fallen foul of the way that the overtaking guidelines are laid out.
Yeah, it was a late dive down the inside, and Carlos wasn't up for letting them through. And I didn't think that was a penalty. And I think the one incident which I think where a penalty was warranted was Kevin Magnussen's on Yuki Tsunoda in the race today. And that, he's alongside, he's got his front wheel inside Tsunoda's rear wheel, and he knows what's going to happen if he doesn't get out of the way, and he doesn't get out of the way, and then sure enough, Tsunoda's wheel snags him, and that's him out. So I think that wasn't great. That was something you could have called as it was happening. But the Alonso Sainz one, for me, that's just racing.
It was also really difficult. I broke it down basically using the racing guidelines that there are for this year, and I don't like that penalty because, if the penalty has a proper explanation, I can accept it. I don't like how vague they were because they made a point of stressing the racing guidelines, and I've gone through them point by point, and I don't see a super clear, overt breach of the conditions that you need to satisfy, basically. Yes, it's a bit of a lunge from Alonso, but I don't think he's out of control. He does get alongside the rear, he does get alongside the mirror, which is now the weird binary point that they've put that you need to get to by the apex. He does keep his car on the track. The only thing he does is obviously the contact puts Sainz off the road, but that's forcing another driver off the track, not causing a collision, So I didn't like it because I just feel like it was a bit murky, and I just think if we're going to bloody go down the route of codifying this stuff, I feel like you at least then have to explain what code was broken. Otherwise, because these guidelines exist to give clarity to the drivers and to the officials, and presumably by extension to those of us watching. But do any of us really know what Alonso got a penalty for?
Yeah, I just don't think that's a penalty. You can certainly say it was a slightly overly aggressive move in terms of the probability of the outcome, etc. So just from a pure, was it the percentage play racecraft-wise, you can criticise someone or question them, but that's not what you get a penalty for. So yeah, I don't really like that. And I'm convinced that a lot of it lies just in, as I've said many times before, you try and codify with simple terms and guidelines, dynamic situations. It can never describe all the possible scenarios, and you just box in stewards quite often on that kind of thing. So yeah, a little bit frustrating. And of course, Alonso came through to 7th in the Grand Prix. We should mention he had the fastest lap as well because he had that relatively late stop and charge through. He could have finished a little bit higher, probably certainly ahead of George Russell, so maybe 6th had the safety car played out a little bit differently for him. Mark, we'll come back to Ricciardo now because he had his new chassis this weekend. That seemed to coincide with an upturn in form. He noted that as well. So is this a situation where correlation does equal causation, or is there still some doubt about that relationship here?
I think there's still some doubt, but we'll see it play out over the next few races. But the comparison with his teammate completely falls down, though, because Yuki Tsunoda was nowhere near the pace, having been regular in Q3 in the season up to date. So something was clearly gone wrong there. So we don't have a good baseline performance now. Is that the situation that Daniel was struggling with in the first 4 races? Whatever was the problem with Tsunoda's car this weekend, and it wasn't something that was that they could identify anyway. So yeah, interesting. I mean, the time in sprint race Q2, so the last dry session in the sprint qualifying, that's the closest to the fastest time in percentage terms an RB has been all season. So that's an encouraging sign for Daniel. But it's all. We haven't got a big enough sample yet is the answer to that question, I think.
And to be fair, that's exactly what Ricciardo said. Speaking after qualifying, he said, yeah, it feels better and it feels like it might be, but I don't have a specific reason still with the old chassis why it might have been problematic. But what he did say is if this carries on for 4 or 5 races, as it's happened this weekend so far, then I think we can probably say it was something like that. So that's what he's hoping is the case. So certainly a positive weekend for him, even though he wasn't able to convert that reasonable grid position into a run at the points in the race.
And the main thing for him is that regardless of whether it definitely was or wasn't, whether it was or wasn't the chassis, he's not wondering about it anymore. They've made the change, and he's doing it. That he made a point of saying it was for peace of mind as much as anything else. So it's just something that the correlation will come with more evidence, right? But he kind of doesn't need to worry about that. He can park now what's happened in the first few races and just get on with things.
Yeah, and that can be very, very important. Now, Haas, they expect to be stronger in China than at high-speed Suzuka. Nico Hülkenberg made Q3 and a point for 10th, and crucially, that followed the introduction of an upgrade package. So is this the start of Haas proving it can sustain this form, do you think?
I think it was encouraging, definitely. The way that Haas has started the season was nice and methodical, seemed to be rooted not only in a good understanding of the car and a diligent approach in testing, but also just some solid development work over the winter, carrying on from where they ended last year and actually applying the lessons properly. Basically, a kind of classic Haas start to the season, where they actually just tick a load of very good, they tick a load of boxes very well, do a load of very good work, and then they, pick off a bit of low-hanging fruit when some bigger rivals slip up. But to have then introduced upgrades and be able to say that they worked and benefit from them, that to me is a bigger box checked and a much bigger positive than just like the points they scored in the previous races. Because for me, one of the big question marks hanging over this team remains because one race doesn't prove it, one upgrade doesn't prove it, that they can develop well, because we've seen them start well before and then just fade through the season and not just be able to add performance to the car. If this is the sign of that changing, then it is just another little bit of encouragement for the team going forward.
And Mark, while we're on the subject of encouraging upgrades, Alpine had its first major package, a new floor, a new lighter chassis for Esteban Ocon as well. Pierre Gasly had the old spec. He finished 11th, and Pierre Gasly in the old spec car was 13th and had probably his best weekend of the season so far. So how significant is this rather small victory?
Yeah, it's good. I think there's two things going on there. I think the team is clearly getting more from the car as it understands it better, and can work around its limitations better, and have just got a better handle on the car in general. And the other thing is that the upgrade is faster than the old car, which is always a relief. When everything in simulation says it's going to be faster, and it's quite often a very big blow when you get to the track and it's not, or it's not as much faster as it should be. So they'll be taking encouragement from that, and but still a long way to go, of course. But yeah, that's by far the most convincing Alpine performance we've seen this season by a big margin.
And even though they didn't score any points, I guarantee there'll be some people in the team that are relieved they've now moved off bottom of the championship by finishing 11th in that race. I know it's the world's smallest countback victory, but I can imagine there are definitely some people that just for morale can now look at the championship table and not see themselves at the bottom, because that was just sort of like the extra kick while they were down, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's just a start, isn't it? It's something. So yeah, all credit to them. And the drivers were pretty confident that they're not too far off, hopefully being able to at least aspire to nick some points in the not too distant future. Now, Scott, what do you think? Should we go there?
Well, we're going to have to, aren't we? There is no choice. We thought we were going to go somewhere else, but unfortunately not.
Well, let's head there right now.
Welcome to Valtteri Bottas Sympathy Corner.
So, Scott, why are we here? Why are we in Valtteri Bottas Sympathy Corner?
Because another good weekend's work came to nothing, and through no fault of his own, he leaves empty-handed yet again. Obviously, it went... the pace of the car was really strong, but in both races, Sprint and Grand Prix, it was just didn't come together. The sprint was a bit more in Bottas's hands. He lost a bit of ground through turn one. Actually had a good start. Lost a little bit of ground through turn one. Kind of running out of grip on the outside and then getting caught in behind Lando Norris's returning McLaren. And then just a little bit of slightly bad Bottas positioning down to turn 6, where he ended up with which Haas would it have been then? Kevin Magnussen diving down the inside, and Zhou in the other Sauber piling down the outside. And Bottas actually clipped Zhou slightly with his the front of the left hand side of his front wing, which caused a bit of damage. So that basically immediately compromised Bottas' sprint race and meant there was no chance of nicking a point there, which is such a shame because that's the one race where they don't have to worry about doing a pit stop. So that was immediately a blow. And then come the Grand Prix itself, I don't think the 10th might have been possible because he was racing with Hülkenberg at the time, but then obviously he triggered the first of the safety cars when it just looked, I don't know what the exact problem was, but it looked like the engine just gave up and he ground to a halt in the runoff area. So yeah, loads and loads of pace. I would say their most competitive one of the season so far, and yet goes away with nothing.
Yeah, and he was running in between Nico Hülkenberg and Esteban Ocon at the point he retired. They went on to finish 10th and 11th, and obviously I know the race was transformed by that little flurry of virtual safety cars that triggered. So he was certainly in contention for it. Actually, he's driving pretty well this season, Valtteri Bottas. I would say it's been a good start, but just not a great deal to show for it. So we are now 5 times out of 5 visitors to Valtteri Bottas Sympathy Corner. So we'll be getting a loyalty card discount very, very soon at the current rate. Right, let's get on to the Race Members Club questions for the final part of the podcast. If you'd like to find out more about the Race Members Club, click the link in the podcast episode description or head to our website and hit Join the Race. You can also sign up to our members podcasts through Apple Podcasts as well. And as now seems to be our new tradition, we'll hit some very race-specific questions now, and then we'll be back to tackle more in our midweek episode. First up, Mark, a question for you from Mark Laughlin, who says, Lando Norris's sprint qualifying lead of 1.5 seconds looked immense yesterday. How does such a gap stand up historically?
Yeah, I mean, 1.5 seconds it's truly enormous. It's normally you'd get front of the back of the grid comfortably encompassed within that sort of margin. But it's in terms of where it stands up, probably somewhere in the top 10. French Grand Prix, Alain Prost, 983, 2.3 seconds. Nigel Mansell, 2 races in 92 of over 2 second advantage, one at Silverstone and one at Spa of 2.2 seconds over Senna, but that's on a longer lap. The particular circumstances of Lando's pole where you got changeable conditions and you managed to get your tyres in the window and those around you haven't. It's more like Nico Hülkenberg's pole in Brazil in 2010, which was over a second. But it's a fantastic margin, and kudos to Norris for pulling it off.
Scott, next up for you, a question from Kairan Tyler Biggs, who says, with the deletion and subsequent reinstatement of Lando Norris's SQ3 pole lap, do the rules regarding track limit violations in a rain-affected session need to be reviewed by the FIA for future events? Weather is a disadvantage in itself, reducing track grip and tyre temperatures. Could the part about your subsequent lap time also being discounted for final corner infringements formally be relaxed in wet sessions?
I see where you're coming from with this question, but I don't think you can, because there will be some circuits where that final corner leads onto a straight with enough runoff where actually running wide wouldn't be a disadvantage. And one of the really big challenges in the wet is obviously going as fast as you can while controlling it on exit and having to hold it within the track width, and that's really difficult. As soon as you relax it in the wet, you're going to have a situation where cars that can gain a load more time through the corner by not having to worry about how wide they run on the exit of the corner. So I don't think that would work. I do think that there should be a bit of consistency. This is one area where there isn't some consistency, and even though we've switched to this track limit situation where the white line governs everything, we don't chop and change track to track, corner to corner. It's not the curb here, the painted area there, blah, blah, blah. It's always the white line. We do have a situation where, depending on the circuit layout, they police track limits so that your next lap's deleted as well, depending on what the exit of the track is like leading onto the start-finish straight. So there's still a bit of inconsistency there, and maybe that bit needs to be revisited.
Next up, a question from Stuart Coulter that I'll take. What did you make of Lando Norris's performance this weekend? Whilst I doubt he would have held off Verstappen in the sprint, it felt as though the burden of not having won a race yet, Grand Prix or sprint, played a part in his poor start and opening lap. Conversely, with the pressure off on Sunday, his performance looked much better. Yeah, I'd be careful about reading too much into the start thing in the sprint. It was a misjudgment. He absolutely should have, I think, backed out of that one and tried to consolidate second, because I think the way that was working, it meant he was always going to end up in that really low grip area and perhaps be in some trouble. I do think there are still a few things to be tested in terms of the wheel-to-wheel racing from Lando Norris, but I'm not convinced it was necessarily the burden of not having won a race. Unfortunately, he's kind of in that position where if he'd gone conservative, people say, well, he backs out of the battle too much. So it's kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't. I don't think it's not something you excuse. It was a mistake. It was a misjudgment. But I think it was just one of those things. He was trying to do what Alonso tried to do in the Grand Prix itself when he came back and was able to still be there to attack into the left-hander. So, yeah, I mean, I think that one blemish aside, Lawrence's performance was very good. I mean, that pole lap, fantastically good, massively dominant in terms of the advantage, really, really well executed race drive. So, yeah, burden of not having won a race yet. Maybe he was a bit too overeager to lead the sprint. Perhaps that played into it. It's hard to tell. But, yeah, I think it's one little data point, and I'm not, there's going to come a day where Norris just goes out and bosses a Grand Prix when he's got the car under him. He did that in Sochi in 21, frankly, until the rain came. And if the team had they did with Lewis Hamilton, told him or noticed there was the second bank of rain, then they'd have forced him in and it would have been a bit different. So, yeah, some things to prove still for Lando Norris, but I'm not overly concerned about that whole narrative. I'll throw the next question to you, Mark, from Nevin Knowles, who says, how much did the low grip hurt Ferrari in quali? In your article, you mentioned the circuit being more rear limited than the normal front limited. Ferrari lost most of their time in that sector, and particularly the turn 1 to 3 section. Was it a case of poor rear grip or another reason why they qualified behind the McLarens and Fernando?
Yeah, I don't think it was so much poor rear grip, Nevin. I think it was more the deliberate choice that they made to compromise the front end of the car in order to look after the rear tyres in the race. And that was, they did that in the expectation that little bit of a couple of tenth and a bit, maybe performance loss wouldn't put them behind the Astons or Alonso's Aston and the McLarens, and they were surprised just how much pace that the Aston and the McLarens had, so that it cost them grid position. They expected to lose the performance and they were going to be paid back in the race. They believed they didn't expect to lose grid positions. So I think it was more of a choice than any particular trait with the track. But the track was a little bit different to expectations in terms of which was the limiting end of the car.
Next up, a question to you, Scott, from Tom Bannister. David Croft mentioned in commentary that there's a meeting being held to increase points down to 12th for 2025. Do you think this would be a good idea? I'm in two minds about it. In some ways, it's good because teams at the bottom are scrapping for points, so it would be nice if at least a couple more drivers could get points regularly. But on the other side, it does lose the value and means getting points isn't as impressive as it once was.
I think it is a good idea. I haven't run through the all the potential unintended consequences of it and looked at it from every single conceivable angle, but I think the pros outweigh the cons. I do take Tom's point that it could potentially devalue a points finish, but what I would say to that is that with reliability being what it is now in Formula One and the competitiveness of the teams, and if we take the current unfortunate closed shop mentality to its ideal sporting conclusion, which is that the 10 teams are more competitive than ever, it will be harder and harder and harder to finish in the top 10. And one of the issues I have with that is less about rewarding the team or the driver that finishes 11th or 12th or anything like that. And it's more that in this ultra competitive era, we do run the risk of really big swingy races flukily deciding a tight championship battle between those teams that are scoring points very rarely. Like, for example, this season, the way Haas is performing, nicking a 9th here or a 10th there, Haas does not deserve to be beaten in the championship by a Williams or an Alpine that at one race between now and the end of the season cashes in when there's a bunch of chaos and finishes 6th and 7th in one race and banks all the points, when Haas could have picked up a point here, 2 points there, or more than that if they'd had, an 11th and a 12th and then a 9th and then an 11th again. And do you know what I mean? They'd have been just chipping away at it. They'd have been getting more points for their 9ths than their 10ths, and they'd have been getting points for an 11th or a 12th. And I feel like the championship standings at the end of the season between those teams will be a more accurate reflection of their performance over the course of the year. So I'm in favour of it.
Yeah, I think it's logical enough. It's not one I have a massively strong opinion on, but I think it's logical to do it.
It's a pretty minor change as well, ultimately. It's not like it's not 10 points for a win turning into 25 points or anything like that. I don't think it's a particularly divisive one, but there might be some people out there that, the hill that they die on will be the points just for the top 10. Ultimately, we do like that kind of number, don't we?
Well, we like a bit of base 10, don't we? But well, maybe they can offset it by finding a new 2-car team if there's someone out there who might want to race.
There's none out there.
Right. A question now I'll take from Oscar Robledo, who says, what was the logic behind Fernando Alonso going onto the soft tyres during the first safety car? And where would he have ended up had there not been the second safety car? Well, yeah, I think probably he could have finished 6th. That was about as good as it was going to had the race gone normally. Unfortunately, Alonso and Aston Martin were a little bit boxed into a corner because they only had one set of hards to take into the race. So Alonso started on medium, perfectly logical, put on the hards. And then the virtual safety car happened, and that was okay. But then the safety car happened, and they just had to pit at that point. And then you're left with knowing that probably a set of mediums won't get you to the end. So they decided the only thing they could do was commit to that extra stop and put some softs on. So it had to be a bit more of an attacking approach. So that was a decision that was effectively made in FP1 and caused by the race circumstances because you've only got 2 sets of hard tyres to take through the weekend. Mark, a question for you from Chris and Gandu, again about Ferrari. His question is, how come the Ferrari lacked so much pace on the hard tyres?
Yeah, I mean, it lacked pace relative to Norris on the hard tyres. I think that was down to the exceptional job that McLaren did in getting that car balance, and then Lando did in keeping the tyres, the temperatures equalised between the front and back. If you look at his pace compared to Perez, it wasn't that different. You know, Perez was able to overtake him, but he was still, he wasn't really, Perez wasn't really able to pull away from Leclerc. I think it wasn't the ultimate sort of performance that they could have had. I think they did misjudge that setup change that they made going into qualifying after sprint qualifying. But I don't think it was a disastrous lack of pace. I think it looked more than it was because of the exceptional job McLaren and Norris did.
It's got a question for you from Paul Hodgen. How can the Mercedes possibly be so different in the wet? And what changes actually occur when one driver goes into a completely different direction from the other? Surely this shows that the team has no clue about their car. You'd have thought that the engineers would step in and give advice on what setup is best. Obviously, you've touched on the second part of that question a little bit already. But yeah, different proposition in the wet in terms of Hamilton wouldn't have qualified second in the dry.
Yeah, I had a feeling we'd have a question like this when you just look at how drastically different the qualifying performances are. But Mark might be best placed to pile in here if I'm wrong. But in terms of what these kind of changes between dry and wet weather performance, the days of inherently different dry setups and wet setups, I think, are kind of in the past. There isn't a huge amount of difference now, I think, through the weekend, especially with the fact that you end up with such little. There's so much that you can change on a car, and you just end up with fairly little time to do it, especially on a sprint weekend. So I feel like this would have just been a case of, for whatever reason, the Mercedes switching the tyres on particularly well in the wet on Friday in that session, and Hamilton doing a very, very good job with that. I think him and Alonso had similar approaches to that session when the rain came and just built up to it really nicely and did a very tidy job. So it could be the driver making a difference as well. When it comes to the changes that occur when one driver goes in a completely different direction, it's hard to be specific. Mark mentioned earlier it usually is mechanical, and that is about as much as teams let on these days. It doesn't. I mean, sometimes you get like overt choices in wing level. Like if it's a track where you could, it's a coin flip between whether you want a skinny wing or not because the different sectors reward different things. Sometimes it can be that, but it's rarely aerodynamic. It is normally something mechanical. Being a bit more specific than that, it's kind of hard to do, really. I don't know, for example, this weekend what it is Hamilton did that was different to Russell.
Question I'll take now from Paul Cromwell, who says, how has the track evolved over the course of the entire race, considering that the track hasn't been used during the past 5 years as a result of the pandemic? Is it what you anticipated? Well, it's difficult to anticipate anything, actually, because when the teams got there, they discovered it had this surface treatment. It was a protective layer of bitumen a bitumen paint, effectively, that was there to protect the surface. It wasn't a resurfacing, and that came as a surprise because no one had been told about that. So there were some questions about how that would behave, but that did wear away quite quickly. So actually the track evolution and the way it behaved over the race became pretty normal in the end. There's that global picture that it became very much rear limited in terms of the thermal deg being the limiting factor. There was no graining. We thought there could be some graining. There wasn't much of that, front left graining being the concern. So it it was kind of strange. We had a set of expectations going there, and then there were some, this could go really weird once we realised the surface was strange. And then I spoke to Mario Isola briefly after the sprint race, and he said actually the surface has sort of cleaned up online, and now it's kind of behaving fairly normally. So from that perspective, it all sort of calmed down, but the track's being resurfaced in July, so there'll be a completely fresh surface for next year. Mark, a question from Juan Jose Aguirre, who says, if Checo Perez would have had the same pace lap by lap as Max at the end of the race, would he have caught and had enough differential to pass Lando Norris? It seems Lando Norris's pace was not that far behind Max's, at least at the beginning of the last stint.
Yeah, just on numbers, if you transpose Max's numbers onto Perez, by the time he gets past Leclerc, he's 6 seconds behind Lando at that point, and there's 17 laps to go. So on the numbers, Verstappen would have caught him about 4 laps from the end and had 4 laps in which to try and pass. Probably could have, but it's not quite as simple as that in reality, because Perez had, by the time he'd got into that position, he'd used a hell of a lot more of his tyres than Max had needed to do running up at the front. So I don't think it's quite a fair comparison, really. You've spent 7 or 8 laps fighting the other guy. You're going to have taken a hell of a lot more energy out of your tyres than the guy up the front who's just monitoring the gap back to the second place.
And one for you, Scott, from Chris Shaw. Were offending drivers such as Lance Stroll and Kevin Magnussen, for example, given penalty points on their FIA licence for their racing misdemeanours? Personally, I feel they're all too readily avoiding any real punishment with time penalties, as neither really looked on course for points. Surely a grid drop for the next race would be more appropriate, and I'd even say reserve drivers should be given an opportunity, if they continually accrue more infringements, to add real consequences whilst giving someone else a go.
Well, the reserve driver will get a go if they pick up too many, because that's the whole point of the penalty point system. They get when they get 12 points, it's an automatic 1 race ban, and they'll learn the hard way if they rack up enough. I think the penalty system is a little bit flawed. I personally would like to see fewer penalties overall, and then more significant penalties for the most egregious kinds of mistakes. I just feel like this is a bit anecdotal. I'd love to have a specific bit of evidence for you to support this, but I do just feel sometimes like, when do time penalties ever actually kind of rectify the situation or act as enough of a deterrent to actually be worth it? Would we not be better off in a situation whereby you either kill someone's race entirely with a drive-through penalty or something like that, or park them if it's so egregious that it merits that kind of punishment, or do we just go with grid penalties at the next one? I feel like we've got a bit of a bloated, overused and complicated penalty system at the moment, a bit inconsistently applied as well sometimes, and maybe the whole thing just needs a bit of a rethink, including how often we dish out penalties, as Mark was saying earlier.
Yeah, certainly. It's become ever more labyrinthine in its complexity, and it's not entirely satisfactory. But I think the principle of, if you're going to have licence points, they should be awarded relatively regularly, for the simple reason that I'd rather you punish a driver who's involved in multiple mishaps over a period, rather than just tying the penalty points to individual penalties. It's all just a little bit of a mess. I think just less. I agree entirely with Mark. Just less penalties, only for the most extreme. Question now from Ian Hanley that I'll take. Aston Martin are very quick in most quali sessions in the hands of Fernando Alonso, but always seems to suffer in the races, resulting in slower race pace. What is causing this, and is there any hope that this can be fixed mid-season, or is it more likely, as with Ferrari in recent years, this one being an exception, they will add more pace to the car, but this will only exacerbate this characteristic, and a proper solution won't be found until next year at the earliest? Well, yeah, obviously you've got the question of the way the tyre wear, the tyre deg offsets compared to the single lap pace. I think there's a number of things going on with the Aston Martin performance. Firstly, they're in a very, very tight group, so small swings make a difference, and Alonso and that team are very, very good at getting pretty close to the maximum of what the car should be doing in qualifying, so that's always very useful. I think when you've got any car, the soft tyres, the fresh rubber in qualifying will cover up a few vices sometimes, and then that will play out a little bit more in the race. So you kind of regress to the mean, for want of a better word, because once you're into steady state running, and as you say, as the question implies, the tyre management and the tyre deg is a part of it, you can't sustain that pace. And you've also got a situation where the Mercedes is generally stronger in race trim than it is in qualifying. So it's quite easy to shuffle that around. And all that means that we've seen a number of times where Aston Martin, particularly Alonso, has qualified more strongly than he can possibly race. So yeah, it's a confluence of factors I think play a part there, as well as the fact that sometimes you can have slight differences with fuel load as the fuel load shifts and the impact that can have on the car. So lots going on there. Well, thanks very much to Mark and Scott for your insight. Head to therace.com. Don't forget the hyphen plenty to read there. Check out our other podcasts, including the Race F1 Tech Show with the legend that is Gary Anderson. Have a look at our videos on YouTube as well. Well, we've got a gap now until the Miami Grand Prix, but we'll keep podcasting, so stay with us for everything you need to know from the world of Formula One.
The Athletic.